Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with a video where I go into all the details of how I actually come up with a projection that I put in one of the videos. Now, on the screen here, you are seeing a segment of the code for my election predictor. This is the one calibrated to Canada, as you can see by the party names in vote change and a couple other things. Now, I'm not going to go through and show all of the code directly because I do not want people to exactly copy what I'm doing. But preventing people from copying what I'm doing does not mean I cannot describe how this works. If you can reverse engineer it based on a description, good for you. It's things like this are the complicated stuff that I would actually be concerned about will be all contained in this file, which I'm not going to show you. Because A, I think it'll make a very boring video because it's a complicated algorithm. And second, I don't want someone to copy it. I worked hard on it. So, it's done for there. So, as you can see here, I have principally 4 categories of demographic information for about 11 pieces there. And I have the vote change from one election to the next. And I have a couple parameters here like pollster bias, beta, today. Today's just obviously the current date, or is the date that I'm calibrating the projection for. So if I were to put a projection out for today for Canada, it would be December 13th, 2022. Now, that's getting into quite nitty-gritty, but that kind of explains the screen here. So, as you can see, there's obviously code. It exists. It's not just a hypothetical bubble. But that doesn't actually tell you much, because how do you make a projection? Well, I have the code. Here's the code. That doesn't help you. So let's start this from the ground zero. Let's start with, we have a poll here. We're using Ledger because Ledger is generally a fairly reliable pollster, though in the field of what I'm doing here, they're not the most useful pollster because they only give you provincial data and male, female, and age. They don't give you education, they don't give you vote change, they don't give you income. They give you urban, suburban, rural these days, but that's not that useful because in my opinion, it's very difficult to use that data because it's very arbitrary what ridings you want to call rural, urban, and suburban. You can kind of use population density, but then you still have the arbitrary how much population density is rural, how much is suburban, how much is urban. It's possible, but it's not a great metric. So that data ends up getting lost. It is what it is. So what we have here, we have the vote intention by province, we have the vote intention by gender, and we have the vote intention by age. How do you make a projection out of this? Well, that depends on the projection you want to do. There's really 2 types of projections, and they're not entirely mutually exclusive, but they're not overlapping. There's 2 main types, I should say. The first one is headline, and the second is by geographic region. My model is a geographic region model. It tries to predict what ridings will go where by what percentage. The headline result is just kind of an aggregate of that, so I do not put much stock in it. I don't really care how wrong my headline is, as long as my geographical region numbers are quite close, because that is actually what my model is trying to do. Some other models try to go for getting the headline, which is more relevant and more interesting in a country like France or the US, where the headline result actually tells you something. The headline result in Canada doesn't tell you anything. If the Liberals walked away with 32% of the vote and the Conservatives with 29, that doesn't actually tell you anything about the seat distribution. Doesn't tell you anything about who's likely to be prime minister, how stable the government will be. It's irrelevant, really. So you don't actually see that often in Canada that models discuss headline results. So if we just pop over here to the 338 Canada page, and I was foolish and went on the wrong one, You can see he has headline numbers, but the bigger thing of his page is he has this Canada map, and we go down here, and he's projecting by geographical region, in this case ridings. So his model is like mine, that it's projecting individual ridings first and foremost, and the headline result, while relevant, is not the primary focus. And I think in any reasonable model in Canada, you're going to see the same kind of thing. So that again leads the question, how do you actually use this data? Now, if you're just doing a headline result, the easiest thing to do is you take this weight, either the weighted version or unweighted. There's some nuance to that, but it depends on how you want to weight things. And then you take these numbers and you put them in a spreadsheet, and boom, you have a program that calculates the weighted average of the spreadsheet based on how old the poll is, the weight of the poll, and the numbers. You can do some more sophisticated analysis with that. What I've been doing, let's see if I can find or a good example this would be. I'll just give an example of one of my raw files, but I have to mindful to crop it a bit because I don't want a particular pollster to be up, because there's some pollsters that I'm paying for that end user agreement doesn't permit revealing, so to not violate contract there. So here we go. Crop this. So we have a sample here. Oh wait, derp. We also have a date. We have a date, we have a sample, and we have some numbers. Now I will note I do some massaging on numbers. The reason for this is there's some polls. It's not that the pollsters are wrong, it's that people lie to pollsters. And I find I get better results if I try to correct this and do weighting afterwards, which is weighting based on where pollsters typically are off. Because, for example, Angus Reid underpolls Liberals pretty heavily, Innovative overpolls Liberals super heavily, as one primary example. Nanos typically underpolls the Bloc, another example. I find that two of those together actually gets a better result, and with the 2021 Canadian election, I was very happy with my end results. The only major flaw with it was how my model was calculating the People's Party votes, which caused it to overestimate the Conservative Party's votes. But other than that known error, my model worked perfectly fine in my mind, and my methodology worked well. So there's some massaging. So these are not exactly what the headline results are for males. But what you have is a date, you have a sample size, and you have a number. In my case, I have square root of the sample size, you multiply it, or you divide it by the difference in dates, how many days have passed since the poll, and then you multiply it by this, and then you sum it up with all of these, do that for every single one, and then you divide it by the total sample size. That gives you your weighted average, that gives you a number. Great. Now you have a weighted average of males. You have a weighted average of females, 18 to 34s, etc., etc. What does that really help you? Nothing. It does nothing for you. The hardest part of this entire process is not anything to do with polling data. It's not anything to do with interpreting polling data. It's not correcting historical polling errors. It's not correcting people lying to polls or missampling in polls or trying to figure out fluky sample sizes in polls and statistical outliers that you can ignore. No. That's all easy compared to this. It's actually finding the data by the geographical area you want. Finding the men. How many men are in a riding? How many women are in a riding? How many are this age group? How many are that age group? How many are this age group? How many make this much money? How many have this education level, etc. In the case of France, how many have a certain job category? Because in France, a lot of polling is broken up by your job type. So if you are blue, well, the words don't translate super well, but like, are you middle management? Are you an employee? Are you retired? Are you upper management? Are you an intellectual, like a professor, etc.? Then there's geographical area: Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, etc. You have to have all of these numbers to get a projection. So what my model ends up doing in the end is, for every single riding in Canada, I have the men, the women, 18 to 34, 35 to 54, 55 plus. There's the three primary education levels, which are easily seen here, which are less than high school or less, a college degree or an equivalent. So basically, by college degree I mean a post-secondary education that's not university. University degree or more, they make less than $50,000, $50,000 to $100,000, $100,000 or more. This data, by the way, is actually pretty easy to get from tax information, which is public, by the way. Well, not in any individual's tax information, but the number of people who file at that tax level. So then once you have all of these, and we scroll up here, we have all of our provincial data. So we have it all broken down by province. We have it all broken down by these demographic groups. The last thing my model does is it takes the vote. This has been the big change since 2021 election, for the record, this edition here. Because prior to this, I wasn't factoring in vote change, and it's really since I started covering the French election that I've added this in, and I've decided it actually increases the accuracy quite a bit. Or it seems like it's going to increase the accuracy. It looks like it would have fixed my error in the 2021 election where I underestimated the People's Party, because my model is like a weighted swing model. So if you scored 50% in one riding the next election and you're polling 2%, let's say you pulled 10% in the first election. Then the second election you're polling at 20%, but one riding you're polling at 25. You're not going to go polling at 35 now, you're actually probably polling around 50. There's some nuance to that. It's not a direct swing, but ignoring every other nuance, that's basically how the model works. But that doesn't always work very well when you have new parties entering the team. If you have, in the US, for example, two parties and almost 100% of the votes go to those two parties, that works perfectly fine. If you have new parties entering, or in the case of France, a candidate who has no history and is making a party that has no history, such as Eric Zemmour, you need something like this. And frankly, even without those, this was probably very useful. Basically, you have the people in a poll who self-identify as voting for the Conservatives in 2021. Where are they voting now? Some will be voting Conservative, almost all of them. Some will be voting Liberal, some NDP, some Green, some Bloc, some People's Party, some other. You factor this in, and it will give you a lot more accurate results when you start throwing these numbers out, because in the example of the People's Party, in 2019, there was a lot of ridings where the People's Party did not run a candidate. So when they run in 2022 or 2021, and that candidate now has a riding, that riding now has a candidate, you have no historical data to base this off. If you don't know where the swing is coming from, that's a problem. The other problem is if the Conservatives lost a meaningful amount of votes to the People's Party, which is true. It's not enough to make any difference in the election, but they lost several votes. It's important to consider that, because the Conservatives in this case should lose some people. The Liberals should lose some people, the Greens, etc., to the People's Party. So their vote shares in those ridings are balanced out by this, so that when you apply the rest of this data, you are looking at a more accurate picture of the electorate. Now, this is all quite complicated, and I'm not going to show the file, but the main part of the code that calculates this is about 200 lines, and it's a quite complicated algorithm, which took me a couple days, or about a week, to figure out while I was unemployed in 2020. These days, I would not have the time to finish that. Funny how that works. So that brings us back to polling. So we have our algorithm back in mind. I hope that explanation makes sense, and if it really doesn't, please feel free to comment below and I can try to clarify. Or if it's really, really unclear and I get enough feedback, I will scrap this video and I will do a take two. But I hope it's clear enough. It makes perfect sense to me, but I've been doing this for about 2 years, or a year and a half now. So I would hope it makes sense to me. But now back to polling. So we have polls like this. This poll in particular, I'll discuss what. So like when you're doing an election forecast, you have to look at a poll. You have to identify stuff like male, female, ages, provinces, other kind of data that you're going to use. Then you have to look at the internal data and see if it makes any sense. Here, you might first be like, oh, Manitoba, Saskatchewan at 38. It's a bit low for conservatives, but with the People's Party at 6 and another party at 2, that would put the right-leaning parties, because another party in this case is almost 100% the Maverick Party. That require why this to do electoral forecast, you need a quite good understanding of the electorate. You need to look at a lot of elections and voting trends before you can even really start doing this. That would put 46% voting for right-leaning parties, which is not that unreasonable. The New Democrats here might be a bit high, but margin of error, sample size, so sample size is small, high margin of error, not that unreasonable. Same thing with Ontario, Quebec. Alberta looks pretty spot on. I would not even blink at this if this was an election result. This seems perfectly plausible to me. The Atlantic Canada looks a bit wrong. The Conservatives scoring under the NDP in Atlantic Canada is almost certainly never going to happen, even if the People's Party is scoring this high. But again, small sample size, one poll, and if we go back here, and we go back to this one, and we go to this second last poll, and we scroll down, and we zoom in so you can read it. Oh, look at this. The Conservatives are at 31 in Atlantic Canada in this poll. So this kind of goes to show one particular example. This can be kind of fluky data. And it's why you can't always take everything at face value with the poll. Now, in this particular case of this ledger poll, I did actually take this subsample because after I did a bit of the massaging that I always do, I'll give you a hint. A lot of the massaging is to do with refusal because there's a very strong trend on who refuses to polls and where they actually vote for. And the hint there is, typically speaking, when someone refuses to answer a polling question, they're right-leaning. It's not always true, but it's almost always true. So you do something like that to do a correction for that. And then the numbers they're still low. I think it works out to be 23 after you do a correction like that in Atlantic Canada. But it puts it so that they're about equal to the NDP, which makes more sense. The NDP is not weak in Atlantic Canada, but they're not stronger than the Conservatives. So the poll doesn't have to always fit the exact ranking. It's not like liberal, conservative, NDP. It just has to. Going from losing 10 points in a month, it's not even a month, that's like 2 weeks. That's a bit extreme and unlikely, regardless of anything else, especially when they only lost 2 points overall. So that's something you have to look out for. Now, an example of something where I did actually throw out is this Ecos poll. Not that Ecos is necessarily bad, though. I think they're a bit more unreliable than Ledger. You look at these Saskatchewan numbers, 22% in Saskatchewan, Liberals at 33. Bah! That's impossible. That will never happen. The Conservative Party getting less votes, like the NDP and the Liberals getting more than 50% of the vote in Saskatchewan in the current era, like 2022, is just so laughable. I don't even know why Ecos published this. That subsample. It's just completely laughable. Same thing with Manitoba. Like these two results here are completely laughable. Even if you consider the People's Party in with these conservative numbers, that's 33 and 31. That's still completely laughable. In Manitoba, in 2021 election, I believe the People's Party, uh, Maverick, and conservative vote share was approximately like 47%. It was above 60 in Saskatchewan. There's no way this is happening. Especially, this is 3 months after the election. People don't move that fast. Popular opinion doesn't move that fast. So these are just completely laughable. And you can just. And what you do here, though, is when you have completely laughable subsamples of these provinces, is you don't throw out the entire poll, because just because Saskatchewan and Manitoba are completely laughable doesn't mean these Ontario numbers, this Alberta number, this BC number, this Quebec number, this Atlantic Canada numbers, these all seem perfectly plausible results. If anything, possibly the Liberals are underperforming in Atlantic Canada and maybe underperforming Ontario, but they're all perfectly plausible results. These two are not. They would require such a huge vote swing from the last election that it's just inconceivable. The only way this could happen is if the conservative leader literally said that we're going to like ban Saskatchewan or something, like directly attacked Saskatchewan. And obviously that hasn't happened, which is another thing. If you're doing electoral forecasting, you have to follow political news semi-regularly to correlate it, because events that cause a big change in public perception of polling are a big factor in trying to understand if the data works. So in this case, there's nothing that happened around January 7th to January 17th that would explain a 30-something point drop in conservative support in Saskatchewan and a 23% increase in for the Liberal vote. This brings us back to these two, though. This poll, well, it's probably easy to see here. This poll originated at January 22nd. Conservatives at 31, NDP at 14, blah, blah, blah. Atlantic Canada numbers, perfectly plausible, somewhat in line with the 2021 election. Not a lot of time has passed since that election, so these numbers seem very reasonable. January 22nd was, I'm just going to double check here because I don't want to quote this wrong, was 8 days before the Freedom Convoy protests started, or at least arrived in Ottawa. This poll happened on February 5th, considers it 21, or 23 after considering refusals. NDP at some quantity, I think it was around 23, and Liberals around 43 or something like that. Or even if we just look at these raw headlines without that, 24, 21, 44. This, completely ignoring political context, is a laughable result, and I would probably ignore it. You correlate this, though, with polling data about support of the Freedom Convoy protests, which by the time this poll has happened, have been going on for a week. Atlantic Canada is the only region in the entire country that has majority disapproval. And when I say this, I mean the majority has no sympathy. It's like 60-something% has no sympathy with the protest. Everywhere else, it's about 50-50 or majority support, or majority sympathize with the protest. BC also, I believe, doesn't particularly like the protest. And the Conservatives, having associated themselves heavily with the protest because they support the messaging, of the protest, the main goal being ending COVID mandates, are heavily linked to this. And Liberals are obviously staunchly opposed because Trudeau continues to lambast and attack the protest completely unjustly, in my opinion. Like, his rhetoric is extremely reprehensible, but that is not the point of this video. So the people who are strongly against the protest are more inclined to stay with the Liberals, and the people who and less likely to vote the Conservatives. So the Conservatives losing a lot of vote share makes a lot of sense. Same thing with the People's Party. They're heavily correlated to the protest. So a lot of people who might be like weak PPC leaning, who I will admit this is likely more of a sample size quirk because the sample sizes are small in every single region, and this is probably this. And these polls are within margin of error for the People's Party results. So it's likely not this, but it's possible that these people could have been People's Party supporters who liked the mandates. I would be shocked. I'm not sure if any of those exist, but it could be. Now, this is I don't want to try to get this too long, and the video's already getting a bit long. So if people want to follow up on this, let me know, and I will provide a follow-up. I hope this was clear. I tried to do my best to explain this in a way that makes sense. This is possibly something to be better phrased as a news article or something or not a news article, like a blog article, but I don't have a blog, and I don't feel like making one to make one article. But essentially, we just go back here. The way my model works is it takes age, sex, education, income, who you voted, how people voted in the last election, and how they intend to vote, how their votes have changed since the last election, and how they're voting by province. Taking all of those numbers, combined with the current year, the current day, this beta value, which is basically just a decay rate to consider basically how much to consider the weight of older polls. The higher it is, the less it considers older polls. And historical bias in provinces, i.e., this province tends to vote this way, and historical biases for pollsters, though I will note with pollster historical bias, I do aggregate across all pollsters because doing it by pollsters I don't think it's useful data, or sorry, it's useful and it makes the model significantly more complicated for I don't think any value. So in the end, you take all of this data, you compare it to the actual percentage of the the raw number of the population of each particular type. You do a bunch of multiplication and other math and a bunch of for loops. And then you get a number which tells you, 7 numbers, which tell you how this seat is going to vote in the election. And you just press this start button, and it does some math, and then boom, it tells you 32.3% vote Liberal, 31.1% vote Conservative, 18 something vote NDP, 3.3 Green, etc., etc. And you can look at the seats by province here, and I do also print out a spreadsheet that tells you exactly seat by which one is it? Here we go. This one. Then you also get another spreadsheet here that tells you vote share by riding. And this is where I use to compare how accurate my model is once we had an election data. And you can go to any particular riding you want. So we're gonna find my riding. And oh look, Liberals 155, Conservatives about 20, NDP about 19. Bloc 0. It's because of the quirks of the model, this is not technically 0, but whatever. The People's Party essentially 0, other essentially 0, Green's about 5. Exciting. That is what my model predicts for my own writing. That is really the case for... This is weird. Not sure what this is telling me. Anyways. That is the end. That is essentially what the model does. I hope that makes sense. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below if this makes no sense at all and you are more confused than you were before. If you have any particular comments or questions you would like to ask about why I'm doing certain things or why I'm not considering other types of demographic data, feel free to ask. Though, spoiler, most of the reasons I'm not using other demographic data is this is the only data that's available in polls. You can only use the polling data that exists. Ideally, I would actually use more than this, but it doesn't exist. And the other corollary to this, which makes it hard for provinces to do it for my model for provinces, is finding the data for the provincial ridings is a lot more complicated because it's not published. So you have to do a lot more legwork, which I really don't have a lot of time to do, but I'm doing my best on that kind of stuff. But otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed the video and have a great day. See you next time.